due to a new baby. Like all babies, it's small. It will make a lot of noise.
The Nintendo GameCube, my personal favorite console of all time. Aside from the fact that I have a fond attachment to the GameCube as a longtime competitive Melee player, it's my favorite console due to the nostalgia and fond memories that I associate with it, as I spent hours playing my GameCube as a kid. Though, believe it or not, nostalgia aside, the GameCube did not sell well compared to Nintendo's other consoles, and it sold poorly compared to its competitors at the time. The PS2 was easier to hack, and also served as a DVD player, which people actually used at the time. Also, the GameCube's online capabilities lacked in comparison to the other two consoles, as it didn't have built-in internet support. You could connect an internet adapter, but very few games, 8 in total, could take advantage of this, thus making it difficult for the GameCube to compete in an era when the Xbox had multiplayer Halo Online and the PS2 served as a DVD player. Aside from the hardware, the GameCube was thought of as a childish console, with its purple, cube shape in comparison to the sleek, black and silver consoles of PlayStation and Microsoft. But regardless, as always, there were Nintendo fans who adored the GameCube, myself being one of them. In fact, it's insane to think that the GameCube was considered a flop, given all of its legendary titles that the console has. And along with every console comes its controllers, and the GameCube's actually my favorite video game controller of all time. So, with that long intro out of the way, what's good YouTube? Kony here, and today, we're going to be taking a look at the history of the GameCube controller prototypes, or as I like to call it, the prehistory of the GameCube controller, as we see how Nintendo came all the way from this, to the classic GameCube controller that we know and love today. I was actually doing research for a history of GameCube controllers video, but during my research, I came upon a lot of new info that I've never heard regarding these prototype controllers, and I thought they deserved a video of their own. So, with all that out of the way, the sources that I use can be found in the description, and now, onto the first prototype controller ever made for the GameCube. This thing, the Dolphin Controller Test 01. And we'll get to why it's called Dolphin in a second, but first, it's important to note that Nintendo is very secretive about its development history and its prototypes. Regardless, many controllers have surfaced over the years, so technically, there could be hardware that is still unknown to the public. But, this is a list of all known prototype GameCube controllers as of February 2023, almost 22 years after the official release of the GameCube, which occurred on September 14, 2001 in Japan, and November 18, 2001 in the US. Again, I plan on making a follow-up video, the history of the GameCube controller, which will cover all the controllers after the official release of the GameCube, compared to this video, which looks at all the prototypes. So subscribe if you're interested in more Kony content, as I'm on the road to 500 subscribers. But before we get back to the Dolphin Controller Test 01, we must talk about the name and concept of Project Dolphin. Dolphin was the development code name for the GameCube, and yes, that's why the GameCube emulator you can run on your computer today is named Dolphin. The official name for the console, GameCube, wasn't made public until Space World 2000, which we'll see later in this video. There were also prototype consoles and hardware with the Dolphin name that were used in conjunction with the prototype controllers from game development, and I'll present those throughout the video in their chronological order with their corresponding prototype controllers. So now, with all that information out of the way, back to the Dolphin Controller Test 01, the first controller prototype ever made for the GameCube. Or as we know, as it was called at the time, Project Dolphin. Manufactured in 1999, roughly 2 years before the GameCube's release in late 2001, the Dolphin Controller Test 01 is the only one of its kind ever made, making it extremely rare. Though, fun fact, it was last seen on eBay in early 2018 and it was sold for $1,500 US, in my opinion, a steal compared to what it would probably go for nowadays, given that it's a 101 prototype. But yeah, as you can see, it's just a test PCB with a detachable RJ11 plug, more on that in a second, to plug in a prototype Dolphin console so developers could test their games. This prototype would have been used on the early version of the DDH, or Dolphin Development Hardware, as it had the compatible RJ11 port before Nintendo eventually upgraded the prototypes to the standard GameCube plug that we know today. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Back to the PCB. It features 2 analog sticks, 2 analog sliders, 10 digital switches, and 1 on and off switch. It also has an unused analog stick slot, its purpose unknown, and also has unused connection traces on the top left of the board. As you can see, there's the copyright 1999 Nintendo Dolphin Controller Test 01 written on the top left of the board, and lastly, the half speed refers to the hardware that it was used on, not that it's one of 2 versions produced, as it was one of 1. For reference, the speed refers to the hardware that it was used on. Early development hardware ran on half speed, but was quickly upgraded to 3/4 speed. Full speed was the fastest, but was not to be seen for a couple more iterations of prototypes. But, moving on, next was the Dev Kit Controller version A, a huge upgrade from the simple PCB that was the Dolphin Controller Test 01, as this controller finally begins to resemble the official GameCube controller, featuring a plastic exterior, buttons, analog and control sticks, and triggers, though with obvious differences, as we'll address in a moment. It was manufactured between 1999 and 2000, with a few hundred made in total, and it came in 2 known colors, gray and indigo, which both featured a clear back shell, though forgive me for the lack of pictures, as there's like no other pictures of these controllers on the internet. As for the differences, there is no D-pad, and instead, in its place, was a red menu button, which served as the start button. Next And slight spoilers, the next prototype actually has similar dimensions. As a result, I've used some footage of the dev kit controller B, but I'll blur out the differing parts, so nothing is spoiled. So yeah, the dimensions are different, the controller handles are longer, and the analog stick is significantly larger than the final GameCube controller. Most notably, the buttons are a different color than the final GameCube controller, and the B button is shaped in the same kidney bean shape as the X and Y buttons, instead of the standalone circular B button. In fact, you could argue that the red menu button inspired the final B button. The Z button was just a simple bluish-purple switch instead of the longer, flat indigo button that it eventually became. Lastly, I didn't see this anywhere else online, but the colors of this controller's buttons clearly resemble the N64 controller, as the A, B, and star buttons are the same color. Similar to the Dolphin controller test cell 1, the dev kit also had an RJ11 plug. This also meant that it was incompatible with the GameCube that it was displayed next to when Nintendo displayed it to the public, and similar to the Dolphin controller test cell 1, the controllers were used with half-speed DDHs at first before Nintendo quickly recalled and upgraded those kits to 3/4 speed. And following the dev kit controller version A, inching one step closer to the final GameCube controller design, they released the dev kit controller B. Unlike the two colors of version A, gray and indigo, version B only came in an indigo color, with the same clear back shell as before. Though, 4 different variants were made, which we'll get into in a second. Unlike the version A, this controller was never shown to the public, though there were a couple thousand of these controllers made compared to the few hundreds of version A, as developers used these controllers on various DDHs to build and test their games. All 4 variants had the same controller build, excluding the labeling in the center, so we'll review the general cosmetic changes first. The dimensions are identical to the prior version, the controller's handles are longer, and the analog stick's much bigger than the final GameCube controller. But, as you can see, they finally introduced the D-pad and changed the menu button from its previous place to where it would eventually end up as the start button, retaining the same red color, though in a different shape and texture than its final version. The Z button is unchanged, identical to version A. Before we go over the 4 variants, early models ran on 3/4 speed, but were later upgraded to full speed, leaving half speed in the past with the prior prototypes. We'll go in order. The first 2 controllers, the DS4 3/4 speed and DS5 3/4 speed, used an RJ11 plug for the old DDH kits, while the DS5 full speed and NR disc, which had different purposes, both ran at full speed and they both had a standard GameCube plug. This is the prototype where the GameCube plug was introduced. The DS5 full speed were most likely used on late dev kits like the MPD-PG dev, or the late DDHs that were full speed before the retail controller was finalized and distributed to developers. The NR disc was solely used on what was called NR reader units to boot special software. The contact pads for B, X, Y, L, and R buttons and all 4 directions of the D-pad were shorted with conductive paint so it could input a normally impossible combination of buttons when the controller was plugged into the device, which would then boot the special software. As a result, some NR disc controllers would intentionally set to developers with some of the buttons missing. As you can see here, there's a Nintendo logo hidden underneath the sticker on the NR disc controller's front shell, while the sticker on the back of the controller reads version B IRD. The acronym standing for Integrated Research and Development, the division of Nintendo which produces console hardware and associated items, such as all these consoles. I didn't bring it up earlier, but the version A also had a sticker on the back representing the same legendary research and development team. The serial numbers for these units ran between the low 1000s to the high 5000s, making it much more common than the version A. The DS4 3/4 speed might be the rarest of the dev kit controllers. Lastly, some variants may have a white or clear cord sheath instead of the standard black cord. However, it's inconsistent. Lastly, some people have claimed that the GameCube controller was inspired by the Virtual Boy controller, as you can see here. But this is the last prototype controller that Nintendo would make in this elongated shape, as now we're on to my favorite of all the prototype controllers, the Space World 2000. Nintendo Space World, formerly called Famicom Space World, was an annual video game expo hosted by Nintendo in which they demonstrated and announced their new consoles and games. In Space World 2000, during August 2000, they hosted their 3-day event roughly a year before the official release of the GameCube, and here they debuted the newest prototypes of the GameCube and its controllers. As you can see, there are 5 GameCubes, and to go along with each one of them, there was a corresponding controller. Some of the sickest controllers I've ever seen in my life. In fact, I haven't talked about it yet, but as a try-hard competitive Melee player, I would have loved this kidney-shaped B button for multi-shining and just ergonomics in general. Unfortunately, 5 of the 6 of these controllers were non-functional display units that did not contain any hardware, while the gray prototype controller that Miyamoto used during the reveal of the GameCube did function. In fact, Miyamoto did a full GameCube controller demo where he used the prototype controller to control an interactive 3D model of the controller on the big screen. Strangely, one difference between his gray controller and the display unit is that the plastic gate surrounding the analog stick was flat, instead of elevated like the display units as you can see during the presentation. Similar to all the previous dev kit controllers, the back shell of his gray controller was clear, but the other 5 controllers' back shell matched the front, similar to the first officially released controllers that we would eventually see in November 2001. But back to the controllers. The 5 non-functioning controllers were displayed on the convention floor for the public. Fun fact, given that these controllers did not contain hardware, the black controller had its C-stick broken, but the staff handling the displays, as it was unconventionally held together. These controllers also all had a clear cord sheath, unlike the black or white ones that have been officially released. Out of these 5 controllers shown at the convention, the pink GameCube controller is the only color that did not see an official release, which I think is a tragedy. This is the hardest controller I've ever seen, and we haven't even talked about the shape of these controllers yet. Compared to the dev kit B, the shape of this controller, with the addition and improvement in certain buttons, looks much more like the final GameCube controller. The handles have been shortened, the analog stick was made smaller, they added the Z button in its near final but not yet final form, a huge improvement from the placeholder sub of the past, and the start button was replaced as well, retaining that same red start button from the menu button of the first dev kit. And this is the last time we'll see the buttons in the same color scheme as the N64. Now, there are two controllers from Space World's display, and Miyamoto's demo that I skipped over for the time being, as they deserve their own section, the Wavebirds. During Miyamoto's controller demo, after he displayed the wired prototype, he introduced the Wavebird, which he gave to a Nintendo employee to display in use of the same demo. An identical prototype was shown on the floor of the convention, though it is unknown if this prototype had hardware. We're actually unsure if this is the same Wavebird that Miyamoto used, or if it's a separate one of its own. It also has a square extension in between the D-pad and C-stick to hold more hardware, similar to the expansion packs of the N64, though this idea was obviously scrapped. Interestingly, around the time of the event, the same picture of a prototype Wavebird that doesn't match the one shown at the convention was released to the press. This Wavebird more closely resembles the shape of the dev kit controllers than the shape of the pictured prototypes, though ironically, this controller looks more like the final Wavebird design. So it's interesting that they decided to display this prototype after they had moved on from the shape. This pictured controller is almost identical to the Space World 2000 wired prototypes, although it has a Wavebird logo printed on it and has no cord. It shares the same receiver prototype as the one shown at the convention, and it's unknown why this controller wasn't shown there. But this model seems to be newer than the one displayed at Miyamoto's demo, though it's unknown if the Wavebird shown to the press was actually ever made, or if it exists in physical form. Hypothetically, it could just be a render. Also, the display Wavebird receiver has an extra error display on the top right of the plastic casing that ended up being removed in the final version. Quickly continuing with the Wavebird, following Space World 2000, this prototype Wavebird receiver was developed. The PCB was constructed for a modified Indigo shell and was made by Misumi, the same manufacturer that made the retail controllers. The top of the controller was shaped to fit the wireless components, and the battery compartment is held with Velcro to the top shell. Believe it or not, this controller works and is compatible with retail receivers. Again, shout out to Carl Sinnett, the owner of the GameCube Controller Library website, as I wasn't exactly sure how rare these were. And they informed me that they're knowledgeable of at least 4 of these prototypes, and it's likely that there's not too many more of these out there, if any at all. So yeah, real quick, before moving on to the next event, feel free to drop a like on the video if you've enjoyed it so far, and subscribe if you're interested in more Kony content, as I'm on the road to 500 subscribers and we'll be making a follow-up video to this one, the history of the GameCube controller. Also, if you'd like to support me monetarily, I have my Patreon where I post updates as well as various extra content. Link below if you're interested in checking it out. Moving on, next was E3 2001. E3 2001 was held in Los Angeles, California from May 17th to 19th, 2001, around 5 months before the GameCube's official release. And it's here that the final shape of the wired GameCube controller was shown for the first time. Miyamoto also presented a functional prototype Wavebird, as well as a prototype Indigo controller. It was also here where the famously recorded reveal of Super Smash Bros. Melee took place. And I've always agreed with this guy.
They really dug for that one.
The Wavebird has an extra Nintendo logo as well as some extra markings around the on and off switch that are not present on the final version of the controller. And the Indigo controller shown and used during the presentation is very similar to the retail unit, although the shell looks shiny, rough, and untextured. The Wavebird prototype controller was used to play a demo of Pikmin during the presentation, as we can see here, with its near final shape. Lastly, there was a third prototype controller displayed, the Panasonic Cube GameCube controller, which accompanied the Panasonic GameCube, and compared to its official release, the controller is missing the white writing under the Panasonic logo. And lastly, back over to Japan for a final event, Space World 2001, held between August 24th and 26th, 2001. Here, the final versions of the GameCube controllers were finally shown, in 4 different colors: Indigo, Jet Black, Spice Orange, and Indigo Clear. These controllers all contained hardware, unlike the previous year, and are all basically the same as the retail versions. The mass production of GameCube controllers began in July 2001, so these are not necessarily pre-production units, but they're still notable. Again, they most likely couldn't have been differentiated from retail units. And with that, that marks the end of this video in the prototype controllers, as the Indigo GameCube controller was officially released less than a month later, on September 14th in Japan, both as a standalone controller and bundled with the same colored console, while the North American release occurred on November 18th, 2001, where all 4 controllers were sold with standalone items, while the Indigo and Jet Black controllers were also bundled with the same colored console. 3 days later, on November 21st, all 3 other controllers were available for purchase in Japan, as well as the Jet Black GameCube and the Japan-exclusive Spice Orange GameCube. And yeah, as you can see, here are the release dates for Europe, Australia, and Korea. Real quick, a huge shout out to Carl Sinnett, the creator of the GameCube Controller Library website. This is where I got the majority of my information for this video, as though I'm knowledgeable on the GameCube controller, I hadn't previously heard of these prototype controllers. Links to the website can be found in the description. A quick aside, I emailed the creator of the GameCube Controller Library website with some questions on the prototypes, confirming that the Dolphin controller Test Cell 1 was in fact a one-to-one piece. But along with this, they filled me in with some deep lore regarding this lost controller. They informed me that the original owner of this unit had originally contacted them, and they had owned the prototype controller for around 10 to 15 years. He originally bought it around 2004 or 5 on the digipress.com forums from some guy in the US for $500 with a short description with something along the lines of a GameCube board with some switches. This is where it gets interesting. It then sold it on eBay in 2018, and ironically, the pictures Carl used on his GameCube controller library website were taken by this original owner as they were the pictures he used on his eBay listing. Unfortunately, the buyer claimed he didn't receive the package. The online tracking showed the package had been delivered, but the post office could not give information about how or to whom it was delivered. The buyer could obviously be lying, though the buyer was in Canada, and the Canadian post office was undergoing a strike of sorts at the time, which caused difficulties in getting information about the delivery. So, as the original owner claims, it's either lost forever, or maybe it will resurface in the future. But I could see a scenario where the buyer was just trying to finesse their money back and claim it was lost. But either way, as Carl says, it's unfortunately considered lost. Ironically, Carl planned on going all in on that auction, but they unfortunately broke their foot that week. This is the craziest part of the lore to me, because if Carl purchased the controller, we'd have much more information on the earliest known GameCube controller prototype. As for all the other sources, I've created a huge Word document with links to all the videos and websites that I used to create this video. Link to that also in the description. And now that we're at the end of the video, if you enjoyed, feel free to drop a like below, or sub to the channel, as I'm on the road to 500 subscribers. And so you can be notified when I release my History of GameCube Controllers video. Again, if you want to support me monetarily, the link to my Patreon with its varying tiers can be found below. And with all that out of the way, I hope you enjoyed the video, and now, Kony is live in 3, 2,
wrist, yeah, iced it, tryna blow it like an ISIS, tryna go touch like a Midas, tryna glide on it like Clyde, just smoking till I get bronchitis, and I'm cold, feel like arthritis.